Hey guys, today we're going to embark on a journey that might sound, at first, a little, well, sleepy. But trust me, as you settle in, perhaps your pillow cradling your head just right, you'll find yourself transported. Imagine, if you will, the wind on your face, the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, the crunch of fallen leaves beneath your bare feet. You're not scrolling through property listings. You're not wrestling with deed transfers or zoning laws. You're just moving with the sun, with the herds, with the seasons. You're part of a world so utterly different from your own, a world before no trespassing signs were even a glint in a grumpy farmer's eye. This isn't just history. It's the very foundation of your existence, the deep roots of every fence, every border, every private property sign you've ever seen. And honestly, considering the sheer lack of Wi-Fi, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in it. So let's rewind. Way back. You find yourself trudging through an ancient landscape, a panorama so vast and untouched it makes your modern-day national parks look like postage stamps. The air hums with the subtle buzz of insects and the distant cry of an unknown bird. Your small band, perhaps 20, maybe 30 souls, all related by blood or bond, moves as one. There are no roads, just animal trails, worn pathways where countless feet and hooves have passed before. You don't ask, whose land is this? Because the question itself is nonsensical. It's everyone's, and therefore no one's. The concept of drawing a line in the dirt and saying, "This half of the river is mine, and you can only drink from it if you pay me," is utterly alien, almost comically absurd. You might as well claim ownership of the sky. Each dawn, as the first rays of sun warm your face through the leaves of your temporary shelter, a lean-to of woven branches and hides, easily dismantled, you rise with a singular purpose: survival. Food, water, safety. The rhythm of your life is dictated by the migrations of game, the ripening of berries, the flow of rivers. You know the land intimately, not as a collection of fixed points on a map, but as a living, breathing entity. You know which valleys offer shelter from the winter winds, which slopes burst with spring growth, where the best flint can be found for tools. It's a pragmatic, deeply interconnected relationship. You don't cultivate the land. You cooperate with it. If a patch of berries is bountiful, you feast. If game is scarce, you move on. There's no emotional attachment to a specific spot, no desire to settle down beyond the temporary needs of the moment. You're like a highly sophisticated, incredibly hairy Roomba, perpetually scanning for resources. This nomadic existence, lasting for hundreds of thousands of years, shaped the very core of human behavior. For countless generations, your ancestors lived this way. There lives a perpetual motion. You don't build permanent structures because you'll just have to leave them behind. Imagine trying to explain to someone from your era that you were going on a camping trip that lasted your entire life, and your tent was your house. Your fridge was the entire forest, and your only currency was your wits and your spear. No wonder they always looked so fit. Mainstream historical fact. Early human societies, predominantly hunter-gatherers, were highly mobile, adapting their movements to the availability of natural resources. Their social structures were generally egalitarian, with decisions often made communally, reflecting a shared reliance on the environment and each other for survival. There was no concept of private land ownership as we understand it today. Resources were accessed as needed by the group. Quirky tidbit. Did you know some nomadic groups, particularly in incredibly resource-rich areas, sometimes developed delayed return strategies? Instead of just taking what was immediately available, they might bury caches of food or tools, planning to return to them later in their seasonal circuit. It's like leaving a Tupperware of leftovers in the fridge, except your fridge is a camouflaged hole in the ground, and your leftovers might be mammoth meat. Talk about trusting your memory. Historians still argue whether the transition from full nomadism to more settled, semi-nomadic patterns was a gradual, organic shift driven by increasing population densities and resource predictability, or if it was punctuated by significant environmental changes that forced new adaptive strategies. Some theories even suggest that early religious or ceremonial sites might have acted as initial, temporary anchor points, drawing groups back to specific locations repeatedly, subtly eroding the pure nomadic impulse. You see, even back then, sometimes you just wanted to go back to that one spot where the sun hit just right. Your senses are finely tuned. You notice the subtle shift in the wind that heralds a change in weather, the faint scent of rain before the clouds even gather. You track animals not just for their meat, but for their movements, their habits, understanding them as fellow inhabitants of this shared world. There's an innate understanding that you are merely a part of the ecosystem, not its master. You don't try to control the river, you learn to cross it safely. You don't attempt to fence in the deer, you learn their migratory paths. The very idea of fencing off a spring, declaring it mine, would have been met with blank stares, then probably a collective chuckle. Like, oh, you wanna own water? Good luck with that, pal. Even when you stop for a few days, perhaps by a particularly fruitful river or a grove of nut trees, the notion of exclusive territory doesn't register. Other groups known to your band might pass through. You might share resources, trade stories, or even intermarry. There's an understanding that the bounty of the earth is to be shared, or at least openly accessible. Conflicts might arise over immediate resources, who gets to spear that particular fish, but rarely over the abstract concept of owning the river itself. This shared paradigm isn't born of utopian ideals, but practical necessity. A single family, or even a single band, cannot possibly exploit all the resources of a vast territory. Cooperation, or at least tolerance, is simply good survival strategy. You still feel the dust of the ancient path clinging to your sandals, that familiar ache in your calves from miles walked in pursuit of the shifting horizon. Your eyes, accustomed to scanning vast, untamed wilderness for a flicker of prey or a distant water source, now begin to linger. They fall almost by accident on a patch of wild grain. Not just any patch, mind you, but one where the stalks seem particularly plump, the seeds heavy and promising. You kneel, your fingers brushing against the ripe heads, feeling the slight resistance as you pull them free. It's a small act, almost unconscious, a momentary pause in your endless trek. But this pause, this quiet observation of a plant's life cycle, begins to stretch. You notice how, after the rains, certain edible plants reappear in the same spots, year after year. It's a subtle whisper from the earth, a hint of something more predictable than the migratory patterns of aurochs or the capricious bounty of the forest. Perhaps, you think, just perhaps, if you scattered some of these seeds right here, where the soil feels rich and the sun warm, you wouldn't have to walk quite so far tomorrow. It's a revolutionary thought, bubbling up from the primal depths of your survival instincts, a little sprout of an idea that will eventually remake the entire world. You gather more seeds, cupping them in your hands like precious jewels. There's no grand plan, no visionary architect charting out future cities. It's just you, a handful of seeds, and a desperate hope for an easier meal. You scratch at the earth with a stick, or maybe a sharp stone, preparing a tiny, unpretentious plot. You drop the seeds, cover them gently, and then you wait. This waiting, this radical act of patience, is where the first tiny fence begins to form in your mind. Because if you're waiting for something to grow, you can't just wander off. Not like before. The land, which was once a boundless highway, is suddenly becoming a destination. Now, let's be real for a moment. This wasn't some idyllic, pastoral stroll into agricultural bliss. You try this, and more often than not, those precious seeds turn into bird feed, or the tender shoots get trampled by a curious deer, or a sudden frost wipes out your hopes faster than a bad Yelp review. In fact, if you were truly back then, with zero knowledge of basic crop rotation, pest control, or irrigation, you probably wouldn't survive this first clumsy foray into farming. Consider it nature's way of saying, learning curve much. Early agriculture was less a green thumb and more a perpetually bruised one. But you, being a persistent sort, or perhaps just utterly exhausted from chasing your dinner, try again. And again, you start to notice patterns, which seeds like which soil, how much sun they need, the best time to plant them. Slowly, painstakingly, you become a student of the earth. You discover that those patches of land where you've invested your effort, your sweat, your fleeting hope, suddenly feel different. They are no longer just the place by the river where the wild wheat grows. They are my patch by the river where I put the wild wheat. This subtle shift in language, this internal declaration of a temporary, personal claim, is monumental. You don't own the river, or the forest, or the mountains, but this small, tilled piece of ground. This is where your future meals are rooted. You might place a few large stones around the edge, not as a wall, but as a mental note, a visual boundary marker. Or perhaps you break a few branches and lay them down, creating a rudimentary barrier less to keep others out and more to remind yourself, and anyone else passing by, that something important is happening here. It's less a padlock and more a post-it note for prehistoric times. Warning, future salad bar in progress. This nascent sense of mine around cultivated land was a radical departure from the shared understanding of the nomadic era. Remember that vast, open-access pantry where everyone just took what they needed? Well, now you're trying to grow your own special brand of artisanal, farm-to-table berries, and you're rather keen on keeping them for yourself. You're not thinking about deeds or titles or property taxes. You're thinking about the hunger in your belly and the effort you put in. This wasn't an immediate, overnight conversion to land ownership. It was a gradual, almost imperceptible drift. Historians still argue whether the desire to settle came first, leading to agriculture, or if the discovery of agriculture forced people to settle. Was it a conscious choice to tie yourself to the land, or did the land, through the promise of abundance, subtly tie you? Regardless, the effect was profound. You needed to stay near your crops to protect them from hungry animals, to water them, to weed them, and eventually to harvest them. This commitment to a fixed location, driven by the needs of your growing food, meant you started building more permanent shelters. Small, clustered settlements began to appear, not just temporary camps. The very act of tilling the soil, planting the seeds, and nurturing the sprouts created a tangible connection to that specific plot of earth. It was a relationship, one built on mutual dependence. You cared for the land, and the land, hopefully, cared for you. And as these connections grew, as more people began to experiment with cultivation, those post-it notes around your temporary gardens started to become a bit more pronounced. A few more stones, maybe a thorny bush or two planted as a deterrent, just enough to signal, hey, this space is currently occupied and more importantly in production. This wasn't about exclusion in the modern sense. It was about protecting an investment, a shared understanding that if you planted it, you generally got to harvest it. It was the original finders keepers, but also planters keepers. Village boundaries emerge. See how permanent settlements created early, informal, community-defined territories. You feel the ground beneath your bare feet harden, not with the packed earth of a well-worn migratory path, but with the consistent tread of generations. The air, once carrying only the scent of distant rain or a fleeting animal, now holds the rich, smoky aroma of hearth fires, the tang of fermented grains, and the murmur of dozens, then hundreds of voices. This isn't just a camp you'll abandon next season. This is home. You're building more than just a temporary shelter of hides and branches. You're weaving reeds into more durable walls, shaping clay into permanent storage pots, and learning the stubborn persistence of mud bricks. The sheer effort of digging a well, of clearing a sizable field year after year, it anchors you. And with that anchor comes a new, subtle yet powerful understanding of hours. You glance around. Where the forest gives way to the first cultivated plots, there's a clearing. Not quite a path, not quite a wall, but a distinct edge. Perhaps it's a line of stones, dragged and placed by many hands. Maybe it's a row of particularly thorny bushes, carefully cultivated, less for their fruit and more for their deterrence. You watch a group of children chase a stray goat, but they stop abruptly at an ancient oak, a tacit agreement in their innocent game that beyond that tree, the goat is no longer our problem, nor is it our responsibility to retrieve it. This isn't law yet, not really. It's more like a shared feeling, a silent nod among neighbors that this is where our good soil ends, and where the land of the next clan, or simply the untamed wild, begins. Think about it. After generations of following the game, of moving with the seasons like a well-oiled nomadic caravan, you've decided to put down roots. Literally. You've seen the success of those first experimental plots, remember? The ones where you nudged seeds into the ground, hoping for a return. Well, now those temporary plots have expanded. You're no longer just marking a patch for a single season's yield. You're investing in the future, building granaries, even, dare I say it, contemplating the concept of a multi-year lease on a particularly sunny spot near the river. If you could even imagine such a thing. This shift, this decision to stay put, wasn't without its risks, of course. For all the romantic notions of settled life, you probably won't survive this. Disease, previously scattered by constant movement, now finds fertile ground in close quarters. Waste management becomes a novel, disgusting challenge. And then there's the biggest one, protecting what you've worked so hard to build. Because if you are settling here, others might be too, or perhaps they just want what you have. This is where the concept of village boundaries truly takes hold. Not as a line on a map, because maps aren't really a thing yet, but as a lived reality. Imagine walking out from your hut, past the communal fire pit, towards the fields. The path itself, worn smooth by countless feet, defines an inside and an outside. The sounds change as you move. The distant calls of wild animals replace the familiar chatter of your community. It's a sensory boundary before it's a legal one. Mainstream historical fact time. One of the earliest and most compelling examples of such permanent settlements, with an implied if not explicitly defined territory, is Saddle-Huruk in modern-day Turkey. Dating back to around 7500 BCE, this sprawling Neolithic proto-city housed thousands of people, all living in interconnected mud-brick dwellings, entering their homes through roofs. They shared resources, buried their dead under their floors, and lived in such dense proximity that the very layout of their village dictated their communal territory. There were no streets, just roofs, and the edge of their collective existence was clear. Where the continuous labyrinth of homes ended, so did their village. Now for a quirky tidbit. While not as clear-cut as a modern border fence, archaeologists at some early Neolithic sites have found evidence of ritual landscapes or activity zones that effectively functioned as community boundaries. Imagine not a wall, but a particular grove of sacred trees, or a set of unusually shaped megaliths, or even specific burial mounds that implicitly signaled, "This is where we are." These markers weren't just practical. They were imbued with spiritual significance, making transgression not just a social faux pas, but a sacrilege. It's like putting a garden gnome on your lawn, but if the gnome also cursed your lineage if you stepped on his hydrangeas. Much more effective, I'd argue. The very act of storing surplus food, of accumulating tools and even early decorative items, created a tangible thing to protect. And what's the first step in protecting something? Defining its limits. Historians still argue whether these early boundaries emerged primarily from a need for defense against external threats, or more from the internal necessity of managing shared resources, preventing overgrazing, ensuring equitable access to water, or simply delineating hunting and foraging grounds that directly supported the fixed village. Was it keep out, or this is ours to manage? Perhaps it was a beautiful, complicated blend of both. You start to see the shift in human psychology. When you're constantly on the move, land is a pathway, a provider, a temporary backdrop. When you settle, land becomes an extension of yourself, a repository of your labor, the foundation of your future. The ground you walk on every day, the fields you toil, the stream that waters your crops, they cease to be anonymous parts of a vast wilderness. They become your stream, your fields, your ground. The idea of trespass, once perhaps a minor inconvenience to a nomadic band, now carries the weight of a direct threat to your very survival. These early boundaries weren't drawn by kings or surveyors. They were forged by communal effort, solidified by shared memory, and reinforced by the daily grind of life in one place. They were lines understood, rather than lines legislated. And as the villages grew and the populations swelled, those informal understandings would, inevitably, have to become a little more solid. But for now, you just know that when you hear the familiar bark of the village dogs, you're home. And the world beyond their barks is, for the first time, not quite home. You feel the grit of the earth under your fingernails, a familiar ache in your shoulders from another day of hauling. The sun, a relentless eye in the vast, open sky, glares down as you heave a roughly shaped stone, its weight pressing into your calloused palms. Around you, the air hums with the collective effort of your kin. This isn't just a pile of rocks you're building. It's a promise, a declaration etched into the very ground. You are witnessing, firsthand, the dawn of the real border, the fortification fence. Gone are the days, or at least becoming less common, when your entire community simply packed up their few belongings and ambled off to the next fertile riverbed when resources dwindled or threats loomed. Remember that feeling of boundless expanse, where the horizon was your only limit, and land was something you traversed, not owned. Well, those days are, for many, drawing to a close. Now your hands are literally shaping the shift. You're no longer merely walking across the earth. You're shaping it, defining it, claiming a piece of it with sweat and stone. You can almost hear the whispered concerns that led to this monumental undertaking. There are too many mouths to feed, not enough wild game, someone might have grumbled around a flickering fire. Or more urgently, those other groups. They eye our stores of grain, our precious water source. And just like that, the abstract concept of ours versus theirs begins to solidify, demanding a physical manifestation. So you dig, you lug, you stack. The first fortifications weren't grand, impenetrable castles. They were humble yet revolutionary. Simple earthworks, deep ditches, and sometimes a thorny, impenetrable fence of interwoven branches. Imagine trying to explain building codes to the project manager for this job. Yes, well, the structural integrity of this wattle and daub mixture is, shall we say, optimistic. They'd probably just point at the nearest saber-toothed cat and tell you to get back to work. And honestly, if you were living back then, enduring the daily grind of survival, you probably wouldn't survive the first week of manual labor without modern amenities. The sheer effort involved in these earliest large-scale community projects is mind-boggling. These initial barriers were less about keeping out a siege army and more about creating a clear demarcation. They were early warning systems, tripwires against unwelcome visitors, and a psychological comfort, a visible statement of communal intent. They whispered, "This is ours. This is where we are safe. This is where we grow our food, raise our children, and bury our dead." It's an incredibly powerful concept, this tangible separation. You start to see how even the simplest ditch could become an almost sacred boundary, imbued with the unspoken laws of your growing society. One of the most famous and earliest examples of such a fortified settlement is Jericho, in the Levant. Imagine, over 10,000 years ago, even before the widespread use of pottery, people in Jericho built a massive stone wall, possibly as high as 15 feet, with a formidable ditch outside it and even a stone tower within. This wasn't just a haphazard collection of rocks. It was an engineering marvel for its time, designed to enclose a burgeoning community of perhaps 1,000 or more people. This mainstream historical fact highlights a crucial point. The impulse to fortify, to define and defend territory, emerged very early in human history, often driven by the success of agriculture leading to settled populations and accumulated resources, things worth defending. But these walls weren't just for keeping people out. Sometimes, these early fortifications had a secondary, perhaps even primary, purpose that goes beyond simple defense. Take, for instance, some of the peculiar early circular earthworks found in Europe. Some archaeologists have theorized these weren't purely defensive structures against human adversaries, but might have served a role in controlling livestock, perhaps even acting as ritual enclosures for ceremonies related to harvests or the changing seasons. The very act of building such a large, communal structure could also have been a powerful way to solidify social bonds and reinforce the leadership structure within the group. It's like an ancient version of a team-building exercise, except the stakes were, everything. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for these early fortifications was protection from other nomadic groups, or merely the desire to control vital resources like water and fertile land, or even internal social stratification. Was it fear that spurred the first walls, or the growing pride of a community securing its bounty? The truth is likely a complex tapestry of all these motivations, woven together by the evolving needs of a settled human population. You watch as a group of your neighbors, exhausted but resolute, pat down another section of the newly dug ditch. The dirt is damp, clinging to your fingers, but there's a satisfying finality to its placement. This isn't just dirt. It's a line drawn in the sand, or rather in the earth. It marks a clear division between the ordered, cultivated world within and the wild, unpredictable world without. It's here, in these humble walls and ditches, that the very first whispers of land ownership and national borders begin to echo through time. They are crude, certainly, by modern standards. No barbed wire, no cameras, no grumpy border guards demanding your passport. But the intention is clear, and the impact, as you will see, is profound and everlasting. You're not just building a wall. You're building the future of property, one heavy stone at a time. Herds and pasture rights. Understand how animal domestication introduced concepts of grazing territories. You stand on the edge of a vast, sun-drenched plain, the air thick with the buzzing of unseen insects and the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of hooves. Around you, a restless sea of woolly backs shifts and murmurs, your newly domesticated sheep, thousands of them stretching towards the horizon. Their pungent, earthy scent is a constant companion, clinging to your clothes, your hair, even the very taste in your mouth. This isn't the quiet, settled life of the farmer you knew from just a few generations ago, diligently tending small, temporary plots. No, this is a life of constant movement, a sprawling, living tapestry of animal and human needs. Remember those modest fields of einkorn wheat and barley, fenced off with rudimentary thorn hedges or ditches, just enough to claim your patch for a single growing season before the earth returned to its wild state. That was simple. A clear start, a clear end. But now, with these bleeding, hungry mouths, the equation has entirely changed. You can't just plant a sheep. You can't tell it to stay put in a neatly cordoned-off square. They are living, breathing, eating machines, and their hunger is insatiable, a constant drumbeat driving your days. You watch them graze, heads down, systematically stripping the land bare. The rich, green shoots vanish beneath their relentless munching, leaving behind a stubbled, dusty expanse. This isn't a problem that ends with harvest. This is a daily, unending quest for fresh forage. Your herd is your wealth, your sustenance, your future. Lose them, and you probably won't survive this. A bad season, a sudden plague, a pack of wolves, any of these could mean the end for your entire lineage. This dependence breeds a fierce possessiveness, not just over the animals themselves, but over the very ground that feeds them. Where do they graze today? Where will they graze tomorrow? And crucially, where did they graze yesterday? The answers to these questions slowly, inexorably, begin to etch invisible lines onto the landscape. You lead your flock, sometimes for days, seeking out lush patches, guiding them away from poisonous plants, defending them from predators. You learn the rhythm of the seasons, the ebb and flow of available sustenance. This valley, with its verdant riverbanks, offers prime grazing in the dry summer months. That higher plateau, with its hardy grasses, becomes your refuge during the colder, wetter periods. Over time, these temporary stops morph into habitual circuits. Your group, your family, your burgeoning tribe returns to these same places, year after year, guided by an unspoken, deeply ingrained knowledge. This era, the dawn of widespread animal domestication, fundamentally reshaped human societies. The earliest evidence suggests that sheep and goats were first domesticated in the Fertile Crescent around 9,000 to 8,000 BCE, long before the widespread adoption of settled agriculture we often imagine. These weren't just pets. They were mobile food sources, walking larders, and mobile wool factories, offering a revolutionary new way of life that complemented, and sometimes even preceded, the intensive cultivation of crops. You remember the communal spirit of shared foraging, where every berry bush and every root belonged to whoever found it. That still exists in part, but a new understanding is emerging. When your flock has spent weeks systematically enriching a specific pasture with their droppings, turning fallow ground into fertile new growth, or when your ancestors painstakingly cleared dense scrub from a particular hillside to improve the grazing, it feels different. It feels earned. It feels like yours. Not in the way a small, temporary garden plot was yours, but in a grander, more fluid sense. This is a territory, a vast, dynamic area where your herd holds sway. Did you know that some of the earliest forms of animal training involved not just herding, but also using specific calls or even songs to guide flocks? Imagine trying to get 1,000 stubborn sheep to move in a particular direction using only your voice. Perhaps a strange, guttural chant passed down through generations. It must have sounded less like a command and more like a desperate plea to the animal gods, or maybe just a really bad karaoke night. But what happens when another group, equally reliant on their own herds, shows up in your valley? This is where the informal, unwritten laws of the land begin to solidify. You might encounter them, perhaps a polite nod, an exchange of news, or perhaps a tense standoff. Our sheep have grazed here for 10 seasons, you might implicitly convey, your hand resting on the smooth stone of your sling. This grass is for our animals. There's no fence, no stone marker, no legal deed written on a clay tablet, but the weight of tradition, of consistent usage, of the sheer number of animals that have cropped this very ground, starts to create a kind of invisible boundary, a recognized right. It's a bit like finding your spot on the couch that no one else dares to sit in, but on a geological scale, with far higher stakes. Historians still argue whether the concept of exclusive pasture rights truly preceded or evolved concurrently with settled agricultural land ownership. Was it the mobile wealth of the pastoralists, with their ever-moving assets, that first forced humans to grapple with ownership of areas rather than just fixed plots? Or did the very act of planting, even temporarily, lay the initial groundwork, with herding simply expanding the scale? The debate highlights the complex interplay between different human subsistence strategies and the evolving idea of land as property. This shift from pure nomadic hunting and gathering, or even basic temporary agriculture, to large-scale animal husbandry, wasn't just about food. It fostered new social structures. The need to defend large, mobile assets to manage vast stretches of grazing land likely led to more organized tribal units, perhaps even proto-militaries focused on resource protection. You're not just guarding your personal patch, you're guarding the very lifeblood of your entire community. The endless march, the daily vigilance, the constant negotiations with nature and other human groups all serve to strengthen the bonds within your own collective. You learn to read the land, to anticipate the needs of your herd, to understand the subtle cues of rival groups. It's an exhausting, relentless existence, but one that imbues you with a deep, visceral connection to the land your animals depend on. And speaking of negotiations, sometimes it feels like you're negotiating with the sheep themselves. You could swear they occasionally glance back at you with a look that says, "Are we there yet? My hooves are killing me." Then again, maybe that's just the early onset of what modern doctors would diagnose as shepherd's fatigue, a condition characterized by endless walking and an overwhelming desire for a very, very long nap. And let's be honest, the smell. It's a smell that announces your arrival long before you do. Forget designer perfumes. This is the original ode to prehistory, a potent blend of grass, dust, and animal musk. You probably smell like a walking, talking hay bale most days. But hey, at least you're well fed. This continuous need for vast, accessible grazing grounds, this reliance on living, breathing, moving capital, started to solidify the notion that certain stretches of earth, even if unmarked by fences or ditches, could belong, however loosely, to a specific group. It wasn't the neat, square-mile property lines of tomorrow, but it was the very first whisper of a concept. This is our range, and our animals will graze here, come what may. The concept of pasture rights wasn't about ownership in the modern sense, but about recognized usage and priority, a fluid boundary defined by the movement and needs of the herd rather than fixed markers. It was the first step on a very long journey, from the unowned earth traversed by all, to the idea that land, vast and open, could be claimed, defended, and inherited. This wasn't about growing a crop for a season. This was about sustaining a living, breathing population that needed endless space, forever shaping the very fabric of human interaction with the earth. You feel the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the plain. The bleating of your sheep softens into a contented murmur. Another day of defining invisible lines, another day of claiming territory not with tools, but with hooves and hunger, slips into the vast expanse of time. The seeds of property are truly taking root, not in the soil of your temporary farm, but in the very dust kicked up by your migrating herd. You trudge through the soft, yielding soil, the evening sun painting long shadows behind you. It's a familiar weight in your bare feet, this earth, a deep resonance that settles into your bones. You know every lump, every dip, every stubborn rock that still needs to be persuaded elsewhere. This isn't just ground you happen to be standing on. It's your ground. The scent of turned earth, a rich, almost sweet aroma, fills your nostrils, mingling with the faint, comforting smell of wood smoke from the nearby hearths. You squint at the horizon, where the faint shimmer of heat haze blurs the line between land and sky. A line that, for generations, has been a little less blurry right here. This particular patch, this fertile sweep that stretches from the gnarled, ancient oak to the whispering bend in the river, has been cultivated by your kin for as long as anyone can remember. Your great-grandmother's calloused hands, remember those rough, strong hands that knew the pulse of the earth. They tilled this very soil, her sweat mingling with the dewdrops, ensuring the grain grew tall and the root vegetables plumped. And her mother before her, too. You see, the transient life, the constant following of herds or the seasonal chasing of wild game, that's largely behind you now. Oh, you still hunt, of course, and gather from the wilder edges, but the heart of your existence, the true anchor, is right here. You're probably thinking, great, more dirt. And honestly, if you were actually here, trying to eke out a living from this very specific patch of earth without modern conveniences like, say, a plow that isn't just a sharp stick, you probably wouldn't survive this. Like at all, forget the artisanal sourdough. You'd be lucky to find actual sourdough that wasn't covered in a suspicious green fuzz. The informal land divisions, they've become almost sacred markers. That large, gnarled oak tree that stands sentinel at one corner, its ancient roots snaking across the ground like petrified serpents, isn't just a tree. It's a boundary marker, a living, breathing testament to where your family's inherited land begins. The clear, cold stream that gurgles its way along another edge isn't just water. It's a liquid fence, defining another border. And then, there's the rock cairn your great-grandfather stacked, piece by careful piece, a silent testament to where his land ended and the next family's began. No fancy surveyor, no parchment with official-looking squiggles, just stones and water and trees, and the occasional shouting match, of course. Because what's family land without a good, old-fashioned boundary dispute brawl? The legal system back then was mostly just who could yell loudest, or perhaps, who had the most intimidating ante. This wasn't an instant revolution, mind you. It was a gradual dawning, a slow, generational seep into the collective consciousness. The more you relied on specific plots for sustained agriculture, the more deeply you became physically and emotionally entwined with them. It shifted from "we use this land" to "this land is ours." And more importantly, "this land will be our children's." This concept of inherited land ownership, passing down a particular piece of earth through lineage, began to solidify not just for agricultural purposes, but also for the very identity of the family unit. Evidence from early agricultural settlements in the Fertile Crescent, like the remarkably preserved Neolithic town of Saddleheruyuk in modern-day Turkey, shows consistent occupation of specific structures and their associated plots over many generations. You can almost feel the echoes of families building new rooms atop old ones, burying their dead under the floors, connecting themselves inextricably to that very soil. This wasn't just temporary. It was becoming embedded in their social fabric, a tangible legacy. And speaking of burying ancestors under the floorboards, some early societies took this connection quite literally. They would inter their deceased kin directly within or very near their cultivated plots. Imagine trying to explain that to a modern real estate agent. Yes, the property comes with a delightful view and Aunt Mildred's femur just under the porch. Adds character, don't you think? It was a physical and spiritual anchoring of the family to the land they worked, a constant, tangible reminder of the ancestral claim. The spirits of your forebears, they believed, watched over the crops, ensuring a bountiful harvest as long as the land remained in the family. The reasons for this shift are still debated, though. Historians still argue whether the concept of inherited land ownership emerged primarily from agricultural necessity. The sheer effort of clearing and cultivating a plot made it too valuable to abandon, or from social stratification, where certain families began to assert control over resources, or even a complex blend of spiritual beliefs tied to ancestral presence and the desire for generational stability. Perhaps it was a messy combination of all three, like trying to juggle 3 greased pigs while explaining quantum physics to a particularly unimpressed badger. Which, let's be honest, is about as clear as trying to read a blurry photo of a cat in a bathtub while riding a unicycle. But whatever the driving force, the implications were profound. It meant that land began to acquire a value beyond its immediate utility. It became a legacy, a source of identity, and ultimately a source of power. The more fertile land a family could claim and defend, the more secure their future, and the more influence they wielded within their burgeoning community. The seeds of ownership, planted so tentatively with those first small crops, were now taking root deep and strong, transforming the very nature of human society, one inherited plot at a time. Hammurabi's land laws. You're kneeling now, not on damp forest floor, but on sun-baked Mesopotamian clay, the air thick with the scent of dust and distant cooking fires. The Tigris and Euphrates, those muddy veins of life, snake across the flatland, their waters diligently diverted into a complex web of canals. You see the intricate patterns they carve into the landscape, a testament to human ingenuity. This isn't the wild, shared earth you once traversed, where a river was just a river. No, every trickle here has a purpose, every ditch a destiny. This is a landscape sculpted by human will, and where will meets water, well, that's where things get interesting. Remember those early, informal village boundaries. The first hesitant fences, the whispers of ancestral plots. They were cute, weren't they? Like a toddler's first crayon drawing of a house. But now, as you squint against the glare, you see something far more substantial, far more terrifyingly precise. You're in Babylon, around 1754 BCE, and the crayon drawings have been replaced by chisel marks on towering stelae of black diorite. This is where the rules got real, not just whispered around a campfire, but carved in stone for all to see and to obey. Or else, you see a farmer, brow furrowed, pointing emphatically at a dried-up ditch. His neighbor, a portly fellow with a surprisingly delicate floral headband, gesticulates wildly back, invoking the gods and probably his mother's honor. They're arguing not over a stolen sheep, but over water. Whose turn is it? Who neglected the ditch? Who gets the precious liquid gold that makes the barley grow? In the early days, maybe it was a fist fight or a shouting match resolved by the village elder. Now there's a system. And you, my friend, are standing right in the middle of where that system was forged. You'd probably not survive this argument, by the way. Back then, legal disputes could escalate faster than a toddler on a sugar rush. This is the era of Hammurabi, a name that echoes through history with the gravitas of a judge's gavel. He wasn't just a king. He was a meticulous, even obsessive, record keeper and rule maker. He understood that a sprawling empire, dependent on irrigated agriculture, couldn't run on polite suggestions and good vibes. It needed laws, clear as the waters of a well-maintained canal. And so he gave them his code, 282 laws inscribed on that massive stela, copies of which were displayed in public places for all to see. Well, for all who could read, which was a very select few. The rest just had to trust the scribes, which, let's be honest, is always a gamble. The Code of Hammurabi is perhaps most famous for its eye for an eye principle, a concept so deeply ingrained in our modern legal thinking that you might forget it started here, etched into stone millennia ago. But beyond the dramatic retributive justice, a significant portion of these laws dealt directly with land and water. Imagine your great-great-great-great-grand Babylonian self trying to navigate this. If you, as a farmer, failed to cultivate your field and left it fallow, thus affecting the yield of your neighbors, you owed them compensation. Not just a hearty, oops, my bad, but actual silver. A lot of it. And if you damaged a shared irrigation ditch, well, you were responsible for repairing it. And if your neglect flooded a neighbor's field, you paid for every lost grain. Property wasn't just a concept. It was a liability. You couldn't just throw up a fence and call it a day. You had responsibilities attached to that land. One quirky tidbit: the code even specified the penalty for watering a neighbor's field without his knowledge. It wasn't about being helpful. It was about protecting water rights. If you diverted water to someone else's field, even if you thought you were doing a good deed, you could be fined. It highlights just how critical and controlled water access was. It wasn't a free-for-all. It was a carefully orchestrated system, like a giant, ancient sprinkler schedule. Think about how this formalized boundaries. Before Hammurabi, disputes might have been settled by tradition or by whoever had the biggest donkey. Now land sales had to be recorded, often on clay tablets, sealed and witnessed. Inheritance laws dictated how land was passed down, breaking away from the more fluid ancestral plots of earlier times. If you rented land, the contract was legally binding. If you failed to pay rent on a field, you could be evicted. It introduced a level of bureaucratic formality that would make a modern tax accountant feel right at home. Historians still argue whether these laws were truly enacted uniformly across the entire empire, or if they were more of a grand legal declaration, an ideal rather than a day-to-day reality in every dusty village. Was it truly effective, or just a really impressive threat? Consider the sheer implications for those first permanent settlements. They started small, remember, a few huts by a river. Then they grew, demanding more food, more water, more organization. Hammurabi's laws were the legal infrastructure for a complex agricultural society. They told you not only where your land began and ended, but also your civic duty towards the communal irrigation system. Forget that time you almost got into a fight over whose turn it was to wash the communal laundry. This was high-stakes stuff. You might even say it was the original Don't Mess with Texas, but with more mud and less longhorn cattle. This formalization of property rights, combined with the stringent rules for shared resources like water, laid down a blueprint for how societies would manage land and disputes for millennia to come. It was the moment property became less about custom and more about contract, less about tradition and more about transaction. You feel the soft, yielding mud squelch beneath your bare feet, cool and thick, a comforting blanket left behind by the departing floodwaters. The air, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the promise of new growth, hums with the excited chatter of villagers. The great annual inundation of the Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, has done its work, depositing rich, dark silt across the fields. But with that life-giving gift comes a distinct challenge. The river, in its generous overflow, has also wiped away every single landmark. Every carefully placed stone, every small ditch, every boundary marker that defined one family's plot from another's has been swallowed by the vast, temporary inland sea. You glance nervously at the remaining puddles, wondering if a stray crocodile, disoriented by the new landscape, might still be lurking. Let's be honest, you probably won't survive this if you're not careful. And so, as the waters recede, revealing a uniformly flat, fertile canvas, the true work begins. Not the sowing, not yet. First, order must be restored to the chaos. This is where the ancient Egyptian surveyors, known as the harpedonopti, or rope stretchers, step onto the stage, literally. You see them now, figures moving with purpose across the freshly exposed land, their long, knotted ropes slung over their shoulders. These aren't just any ropes. They are meticulously measured and knotted at precise intervals, acting as the ancient world's most crucial measuring tape. Imagine the training it took to perfectly stretch these ropes over uneven ground, ensuring exact distances. It was geometry in action, long before the Greeks ever wrote a theorem about it. In fact, the necessity of annual resurveying after the Nile's floods directly spurred the advanced understanding of geometry that characterized ancient Egyptian civilization. You watch as a team approaches a field, consulting a scroll of papyrus covered in hieroglyphs and diagrams, the ancestral records of land ownership. They're not guessing here. They're meticulously re-establishing lines that have existed for generations, lines that might have been defined by old sycamore trees, or perhaps a particularly large rock that was still visible from the nearby temple. Except now, the trees might be gone, and the rock might be buried under a foot of new mud. Their job isn't just about drawing lines. It's about reinscribing order into the very fabric of society, ensuring each family gets their rightful share of the fertile land for the next growing season. Without this precise reallocation, disputes would erupt faster than spring shoots after a good rain. And given the nature of ancient Egyptian justice, you probably don't want to be involved in one of those. The Harpedonopti were more than just land measurers. They were guardians of the agricultural economy, the tax base, and ultimately the stability of the kingdom. Think of the immense pressure on these individuals. Their calculations determined who paid what in taxes, who could feed their family, and who might go hungry. Their work was so vital that it often had a ritualistic quality to it, almost like they were performing a sacred act of cosmic realignment. After all, the flood was seen as a divine gift, but also a momentary disruption of the established order. The surveyors, in a sense, were helping the gods put everything back in its rightful place. They didn't have GPS, obviously. They relied on observation of the stars, simple plumb bobs, and their incredibly accurate ropes. And of course, a healthy dose of patience. Imagine trying to get a perfectly straight line over a freshly flooded field, sinking slightly with every step. It's enough to make you wish for a nice, dry desert job, perhaps counting grains of sand. And can you imagine the office gossip? Did you hear about Rick Meyer? His rope was off by a cubit, and now half the village thinks they own Pharaoh's personal date palm grove. This annual reset of boundaries highlights a fascinating aspect of land ownership in ancient Egypt. While plots were passed down through families, the physical manifestation of those plots literally vanished every year. It wasn't about a fence or a wall that stayed put, but about a recorded right to a specific area that had to be physically marked out anew. This stands in stark contrast to the more permanent markers we saw emerging in village boundaries, or even Hammurabi's fixed property laws. The Nile forced a fluid, dynamic concept of land. A particularly quirky tidbit about these rope stretchers is their legendary status as the originators of practical geometry. It wasn't an abstract academic pursuit for them. It was a matter of survival. They understood concepts like right angles and triangles out of necessity, long before Euclid put pen to papyrus. They might have even used a special knot on their ropes to form a perfect 3 to 4 to 5 triangle, ensuring a precise corner for a field boundary. Historians still argue whether the precision of these resurveys was primarily driven by practical agricultural needs, or by a deeper, perhaps spiritual, desire to restore cosmic order to a landscape annually thrown into chaos. Was it purely about ensuring fair taxation and food production? Or was there an element of re-establishing Ma'at, the concept of cosmic balance and justice, on a localized human scale? Whatever the primary motivation, their meticulous work allowed one of the greatest civilizations to thrive for millennia, all thanks to some clever rope stretchers and a very muddy, fertile river. You feel the warm Mediterranean sun on your face. Hear the distant clamor of the agora, that vibrant marketplace where ideas are traded as freely as olives and amphorae. You're not just re-establishing boundaries on muddy riverbanks anymore, like those diligent Egyptian surveyors who, bless their hearts, probably had very little time for abstract thought beyond where exactly the high water mark left off. Oh no. Now you're stepping into the sun-drenched courtyards and shaded stoas of ancient Greece, where the very concept of owning a patch of earth begins to ripple through the minds of thinkers whose names still echo through the millennia. It's here, amidst the aroma of roasting lamb and philosophical debate, that you begin to consider something revolutionary. Not just how to divide land, but should you divide it at all? This isn't about floods resetting your property lines. It's about whether those lines should exist in the first place. Imagine you're reclining on a marble bench, perhaps a little too comfortably, as a bearded man with a serious expression. Let's call him Plato. Because, well, it probably is Plato begins to expound on his ideal society. He's telling you, with all the earnestness of a person who has clearly never tried to herd a dozen goats into a communal pen, that land, like many other things, should be held in common. No private ownership for the guardians, the elite class of his perfect republic. They'd share everything, their homes, their children, and yes, their land. The idea was to prevent greed and factionalism, to ensure that the rulers were utterly devoted to the state, not to their personal estates. You can almost hear the crickets chirping in the silence that follows, broken only by the occasional clatter of a potter's wheel in the distance. It sounds utopian, doesn't it? Like a grand, marble-hewn commune where everyone holds hands and sings Kumbaya while the olives ripen. Except, with less singing and more intense philosophical wrestling. Now you, a mere mortal accustomed to your little patch of land, remember that ancestral plot we talked about, the one passed down through generations. You're probably thinking, but where do I plant my personal olive tree, Plato? Where do I store my secret stash of artisanal cheese? He'd probably just give you a serene, slightly exasperating smile and explain that such trivial concerns distract from the pursuit of pure justice. Good luck with that, pal. Honestly, if you actually tried to live in Plato's Republic as a guardian with no private property, you probably won't survive this particular social experiment. You'd be too busy trying to figure out whose turn it was to clean the communal latrines or arguing over who got the sunny spot for their vegetable patch. It sounds great on paper, less so when you realize you have no personal space to escape to. Then comes Aristotle, Plato's most famous student, stepping forward with a much more grounded perspective. He's less about radical communalism and more about what actually works for humans, those messy, imperfect creatures we are. Aristotle, with the practical wisdom of someone who probably did own a nice vineyard, argued pretty convincingly for private property. He believed that when people own something, they take better care of it. Think about it. Remember those ancient irrigation ditches from Hammurabi's time. Who's going to maintain them better? A collective group with no individual stake, or a farmer who knows his livelihood depends on that water flowing smoothly to his crops. Aristotle's logic was simple. Private ownership fosters greater productivity, encourages self-sufficiency, and provides a sense of personal responsibility. Plus, he noted, there's a distinct pleasure in knowing something is yours, a feeling of generosity when you share it with friends, and let's be honest, a certain satisfaction in having enough space to escape your annoying neighbors. He wasn't entirely against public land, mind you. He saw the value in shared resources like pastures or public buildings within the polis, that quintessential Greek city-state that was the hub of everything. But for the basic means of production, for the land that fed families, private ownership was the way to go. This balance between public and private space was a mainstream historical fact of Greek city-states. Land was mostly privately held, but there were significant public lands for civic use, religious sites, and common pasturing. This intellectual heavyweight bout wasn't just theoretical musing. These were the core philosophical arguments that underpinned how land was actually structured in Greek society, even if the implementation rarely matched the lofty ideals. For instance, in some early city-states, there was a quirky system where land, particularly agricultural land, was initially allotted to citizens in equal shares, a concept known as cleri. But these often quickly became unequal through inheritance or sale. Historians still argue whether this initial equality was truly widespread or just an idealized legal fiction. quickly undermined by the realities of economic competition and social stratification. Was it a genuine attempt at egalitarianism, or just a temporary measure before the inevitable accumulation of wealth? The debate continues to rumble like distant thunder. Even as philosophers debated, the everyday reality of land ownership in Greece was complex. You had citizens with full property rights, often tied to their military service. Then you had the meticulously resident foreigners, who might lease land but generally couldn't own it outright. And of course, the enslaved population, who were property themselves and worked the land for others. It was a layered cake of rights and restrictions, far removed from Plato's harmonious vision of shared everything. You can imagine a philosopher, deep in thought, walking past a farmer painstakingly tending his own rows of grapevines, both utterly convinced of the correctness of their respective views on land, neither truly understanding the other's reality. It's almost like they were speaking entirely different languages, one of abstract ideals and the other of calloused hands and aching backs. You can almost smell the dust rising from the farmer's sandals as he trudges home, perhaps grumbling about the latest tax on his olive oil, while the philosopher, oblivious, sketches diagrams in the sand. You might even hear tales of land redistribution efforts, particularly in times of social unrest, when the poor would demand a fairer share of the earth's bounty. These were usually met with fierce resistance from the wealthy landowners. It's a recurring theme throughout history, isn't it? The haves versus the have-nots, arguing over who gets to dig their toes into the soil. Imagine the debates in the Athenian assembly, voices rising and falling like the waves on the nearby coast, as citizens argued over land disputes, inheritance laws, and the very definition of what constituted a good use of land. Was it for the individual's profit or for the collective good of the polis? These weren't just abstract ideas. They were the very real arguments that shaped the fabric of their lives, determining who ate well, who prospered, and who, frankly, went without. The air itself seems thick with the weight of these ancient arguments, carried on the Mediterranean breeze. As you drift further into the history of how these invisible lines became so undeniably real, you wander now, your sandals kicking up dust on a sun-baked Roman road, the air thick with the scent of olive groves and the distant murmur of a bustling city. You're not just passing through a landscape, you're traversing a tapestry of ownership, a meticulously woven web of rights and responsibilities that would make a modern lawyer weep with joy or despair. Remember those simple, communal boundaries near the Nile, easily reset by a flood, or the more ambiguous Greek debates on who truly owned what. Well, the Romans took one look at that, shrugged, and said, "Hold my mulsum." They didn't just formalize land. They built an entire civilization around its precise definition. Imagine standing on a small plot of land, perhaps just outside the city walls. Is it yours? Can you build on it? Can you sell it? Can you lend it to your cousin who, let's be honest, is probably going to try and turn it into a gladiatorial training camp for gerbils? For the Romans, these weren't idle questions. They were the bedrock of their society, the very framework upon which their empire was built. They didn't just draw lines on maps. They inscribed them into law, creating a legacy that echoes even in your property deeds today. Here, in the heart of the Roman Empire, the concept of dominium reigned supreme. This wasn't just owning something. It was about having absolute, unencumbered rights over a piece of land. You, as the dominus, held ultimate authority, the right to possess, use, enjoy, and even destroy it, though, really, why would you destroy your perfectly good vineyard? It was a power far more defined than anything seen before. A clear, unmistakable declaration of "this is mine, and not yours." This was a mainstream historical fact that fundamentally shifted the understanding of private property. It wasn't just about possession. It was about an abstract legal right that persisted even if you weren't physically present on the land. But Rome being Rome, it wasn't that simple. They layered complexity upon complexity, like an ambitious chef adding too many exotic spices. You see, while you might hold dominium, someone else could hold usufruct, the right to use and enjoy your property, to reap its fruits, perhaps for their lifetime, without ever owning it themselves. Think of it as a very long-term lease where the tenant gets all the benefits of the harvest, but you still own the soil. Or consider servitudes, lesser rights that one piece of land might hold over another. Maybe your neighbor, whose land is landlocked, has a servitus via, a right-of-way to cross your fields to reach the main road. Or a servitus aqueductus, allowing them to run an aqueduct across your property. These weren't just neighborly courtesies. They were legally binding rights, meticulously recorded, often etched onto stone markers, ensuring that disputes, while inevitable, at least had a clear legal pathway to resolution. You probably won't survive this if you try to claim an abandoned Roman villa without proper paperwork. The ghosts of meticulous Roman lawyers would simply haunt you with endless legal summons. The transfer of land, especially res mancipi, things considered crucial for Roman life like land, slaves, and large beasts of burden, was no casual handshake deal. Oh no, it involved a formal ceremony called mancipatio. Imagine you're standing before 5 witnesses, all Roman citizens of a certain age, and a libripens holding a bronze scale. You, the seller, touch the scale with a bronze ingot, declaring the property is yours according to Roman law, and then transfer it to the buyer. It was a public, solemn declaration, leaving no doubt as to the transfer of ownership. And if for some reason mancipatio wasn't appropriate, there was an iursessio, a staged lawsuit before a magistrate where the buyer claimed the property, and the seller simply didn't dispute it, allowing the magistrate to officially assign ownership. It was a legal pantomime, but an effective one. The meticulousness extended to the very ground itself. Roman surveyors, the agrimensors, were highly trained professionals, armed with tools like the groma, a cross-shaped sighting instrument, and the corybates, a long, level-checking board. They didn't just eyeball boundaries. They laid out new towns, divided conquered lands into precise grids for veteran soldiers, and re-established property lines after disputes or natural changes. They even consecrated boundary stones, known as cippi, which often bore the name of the owner or the boundaries they marked. The god Terminus, the deity of boundaries, was taken very seriously. To move a boundary stone was a grave religious and legal offense, practically inviting divine wrath and certainly a very stern talking-to from a magistrate. It's a quirky tidbit, perhaps, but it speaks volumes about the sacred reverence they held for fixed, indisputable lines. The Romans also had a clear distinction between ager publicus, public land, typically acquired through conquest, and ager privatus, private land. While the state retained ultimate ownership of public land, individuals could obtain rights to use it, often for grazing or cultivation, in exchange for a fee. This led to complex issues, especially as wealthy elites often acquired vast tracts of ager publicus, leading to land reform movements and social unrest. Think of the Gracchi brothers, who famously tried to redistribute public land to the poor, only to meet rather unfortunate ends. Historians still argue whether the Roman emphasis on private land ownership, with its intricate legal architecture, truly democratized property rights, or if it primarily served to solidify the power and wealth of the existing elite. Did it create a more stable, productive society by clearly defining who owned what, thereby incentivizing investment and cultivation? Or did it exacerbate inequalities, creating a vast class of landless poor dependent on the patronage of a few powerful landowners? It's a debate that continues to echo through legal systems even today, pondering the balance between individual property rights and collective well-being. So, as you step off that dusty Roman road, imagine the invisible lines, the ancient laws, the complex transfers, and the divine protections that made a piece of land real to the Romans. They built a world of defined ownership, where every field, every villa, every path was not just a physical space, but a precise legal construct, enduring long after the physical structures crumbled into dust. It was a world built on lines, lines of stone, lines of law, lines of power. Imagine, if you will, the crisp, cold air of early medieval Europe biting at your exposed skin as you trudge through muddy tracks. The scent of wood smoke hangs heavy, mingling with something less pleasant. Maybe the pigsty you just passed, or perhaps just the general aroma of unwashed humanity that permeates the small, clustered village houses. This isn't a quick trip to the grocery store, no, this is your daily reality. You're not just walking across land, you're walking on someone's land, inextricably tied to it. The very dirt beneath your worn boots is a foundation of power, a symbol of absolute authority in a way that Hammurabi's neat rows of barley never quite managed, or even Rome's meticulously catalogued deeds. Here, in the sprawling, often chaotic landscape of the feudal age, land isn't merely property. It is the currency, the contract, the very essence of existence. And let's be honest, statistically speaking, your chances of living past 35 are pretty slim, let alone ever truly owning any of this land yourself. You are, for all intents and purposes, part of the scenery, a vital, moving component of the Lord's domain. This is the manorial system, a vast, interwoven tapestry of rights and obligations that defined almost every aspect of life for centuries. After the decline of centralized Roman authority, and with it, the sophisticated legal frameworks for property we discussed, Europe fractured into countless smaller power centers. Without a strong emperor or king to enforce laws and protect trade, local strongmen, the future feudal lords stepped into the vacuum. Their power didn't come from decrees or abstract legal concepts alone, but from the most tangible asset imaginable, the land itself. You see it everywhere you look, the lord's castle looming on the hill, or his fortified manor house dominating the village, a constant, inescapable reminder of who holds the reins. Every field, every patch of woodland, every stream, every dwelling falls under his purview. You work a strip of land, maybe just a few acres, and while you might think of it as yours in a practical, day-to-day sense, you plow it, you sow it, you harvest its meager bounty. It is, in legal and practical reality, merely a holding granted by the Lord. You owe him service for it, typically several days a week toiling on his personal land, known as the domain, planting his crops, repairing his fences, mending his roads. This isn't just about paying rent. It's about acknowledging a fundamental social contract, where the land provides sustenance in exchange for your labor and loyalty. It's a very personal relationship, sometimes brutally so. If you want to grind your grain, you must use the Lord's mill and pay a fee, a concept known as banalities. If you bake bread, it's the Lord's oven. Even if your daughter marries a boy from the next village over, you might owe the Lord a payment, a merchant, because he's losing a potential laborer. It's a system that binds you to the soil, a direct consequence of land becoming the ultimate, irreducible form of wealth and authority. Historians still argue whether feudalism was a coherent system or a collection of disparate, evolving practices. But what's clear is that the fundamental principle remained. Land was power. The more land a lord controlled, the more serfs he commanded, the more resources he possessed, and thus, the more influence he wielded. This direct correlation between territory and authority meant that boundaries, however informal they might sometimes appear on the ground, a weathered stone, a particular oak tree, a slight rise in the terrain were fiercely protected. They weren't just lines on a map. They were the very limits of a lord's dominion, the physical manifestation of his might. Sometimes, even the local pigs understood this. There are quirky records of medieval court cases where pigs, notorious for rooting around freely, were sometimes brought to trial for straying across manorial boundaries and damaging crops. A bizarre example of how deeply embedded the concept of territorial transgression was, even for farm animals. This shift from the communal and sometimes fluid land use of early settlements to the rigidly defined manorial system marks a profound turning point in how humans perceived and interacted with the earth. It wasn't just about farming. It was about defining hierarchies, solidifying social structures, and establishing political control. The fences and boundaries of this era weren't merely for keeping livestock in or intruders out. They were the invisible, yet incredibly potent, lines of power drawn by custom, enforced by the Lord's armed retainers, and legitimized by a web of reciprocal, if often unequal obligations. You were born on this land, you worked this land, and when your time came, you would likely be buried in the churchyard on this very same land, forever a part of the Lord's domain. Your life was, quite literally, defined by the boundaries of his field. You squint, the low sun barely piercing the perpetual haze of the industrial dawn. The air, thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp earth, bites at your nostrils. It's a stark contrast to the verdant, open fields you remember from your grandmother's stories, the ones where everyone's geese waddled together, indistinguishable in their honking democracy. Now, as you trudge along a muddy track, a new reality asserts itself with sharp, unyielding lines. Fences. Not the rickety, patched-up affairs that merely suggested a boundary, but formidable, often stone or deep-hedged divisions, bisecting the very landscape you once knew as limitless. Remember the vast, unowned spaces from those earliest days, where the land breathed with the rhythm of nomadic footsteps. And then the tiny garden plots, remember those, scratched out for a season before fading back into the communal tapestry. Well, you've arrived at a moment in history where that tapestry is being unpicked, thread by painstaking, painful thread, and rewoven into something entirely different. Something that screams, quite literally, mine. This is the age of enclosure, my sleepy friend, and it's about to change everything. You see, for centuries, much of the arable land and vast swathes of forest and pasture in places like medieval England weren't owned by individuals in the way we understand it today. They were commons. Think of it as a community pantry, but for land. Villagers had rights to graze their livestock, collect firewood, fish in the streams, even gather wild berries or medicinal herbs. You could let your cow wander onto the village green, or send your pig rooting in the woods for acorns, and no one would bat an eye. It was an unspoken, often unwritten, contract of shared survival. It was inefficient, sure, by later standards, but it was common. Then came the gentle nudges, then the shoves, and finally, the full-blown, legalistic charge of change. It began subtly. Sometimes with a local lord deciding his land would be more profitable if he fenced off a bit of common pasture to raise sheep for the booming wool trade. Wool, remember, was the medieval equivalent of crude oil. Everyone wanted it, and you could get rich providing it. And who doesn't love a nice, scratchy jumper? But these were isolated acts at first, often met with grumbling or even outright resistance. Then things got serious. From the 15th to the 19th centuries, particularly in England, a phenomenon known as the enclosure movement gained unstoppable momentum. It wasn't a spontaneous uprising of fence lovers. It was a series of parliamentary acts and private agreements that systematically converted common land and open fields into privately owned, consolidated blocks. It was, if we're being honest, the grand legal heist of shared resources. For many, losing access to those commons was the equivalent of waking up one morning to find your fridge, pantry, and entire backyard suddenly owned by a distant cousin you've never met, who then charges you rent to breathe your own air. You probably wouldn't survive that, or at least you develop a serious caffeine dependency. The arguments for enclosure were framed in terms of progress and efficiency. Proponents, often wealthy landowners or aspiring farmers, argued that open fields with their scattered strips and common rights were unproductive. How could you innovate, they asked, when everyone's cow could wander into your experimental barley patch? How could you drain a bog if half of it belonged to the bloke down the lane who liked his boggy bits? And they had a point from a purely economic perspective. Consolidated fields, they argued, could be farmed more intensively, with new techniques, leading to higher yields and more food for a growing population. It was the agricultural revolution, in a very real sense, being built on freshly laid fences. This wasn't just about sheep and barley, though. It was about defining and asserting ownership in a way that had never truly existed before for large swathes of land. Suddenly, the hedges grew taller, the ditches deeper, and the no trespassing signs, though not yet literal metal plates, were writ large in the very landscape. The visual impact was profound. Imagine flying over England today and seeing that patchwork quilt of fields. That's largely a legacy of the enclosure movement. Before, it was a much more amorphous, communal sprawl. But the human cost was immense. For generations, families had relied on those common lands to supplement their meager incomes from their small, often scattered plots. They grazed a cow, collected fuel, snared a rabbit, ensuring they didn't starve during lean times. With the commons gone, these rural poor found themselves dispossessed, their traditional way of life eradicated. Many were forced off the land entirely, becoming landless laborers, or more often, migrating to burgeoning towns and cities in search of work in the nascent factories of the Industrial Revolution. It was a mass migration driven by a lack of options, a historical nudge towards the urban sprawl we now take for granted. One particularly peculiar aspect of common rights was turbary, which allowed people to cut peat for fuel from designated bogs. Losing turbary rights meant that some families, who had relied on peat for centuries to heat their homes, suddenly found themselves literally left in the cold, forcing them to buy expensive alternatives or simply shiver. Imagine having a legal right to dig up your backyard for fuel, and then one day Parliament says, "Nope, that dirt is now someone else's garden." The debates around enclosure were fierce and often violent. There were riots, protests, and even organized resistance. Figures like Gerard Winstanley and the diggers in the 17th century famously challenged the very concept of private land ownership, arguing that the earth was a common treasury for all. Their efforts, while ultimately suppressed, echo through history as a powerful counter-narrative to the prevailing tide of privatization. They questioned whether the earth could ever truly be owned, a philosophical query that continues to ripple through environmental and social justice movements today. Historians widely agree that the Enclosure Acts, particularly those passed extensively during the 18th and early 19th centuries, played a pivotal role in creating a landless proletariat, providing the necessary labor force for the burgeoning factories of the Industrial Revolution. Without this displacement from rural areas, the rapid urbanization and factory system might have developed very differently, or much more slowly. Historians still argue whether the long-term benefits of increased agricultural efficiency and national food security, spurred by enclosure, ultimately outweighed the immediate human cost of mass displacement, poverty, and the destruction of traditional rural communities. Was it a necessary evil for progress, or a profound injustice that laid the groundwork for future social inequalities? As you walk, the new fences feel less like boundaries and more like cages. The horizon, once a promise of open fields and shared bounty, is now a grid of private holdings, each with an invisible yet ironclad lock. The very air seems to hum with the quiet hum of ownership, a fundamental shift in human relationship with the earth that reverberates even into your own modern experience. Every garden fence, every property line, every keep out sign you encounter today has its roots in this moment. This profound, controversial redefinition of what it means to possess a piece of the planet. The old ways, the communal rhythms of life on the commons, are fading into memory, replaced by the relentless march of individually owned parcels. This new world, neat and ordered from a distance, feels increasingly fragmented up close, each segment now a distinct and jealously guarded entity. You can almost hear the whispered grumbling of generations past, echoing from beyond the newly planted hedgerows, lamenting the loss of a freedom they once considered their birthright. The concept of shared sustenance, of collective responsibility for the land that fed everyone, is being systematically dismantled. In its place, a new doctrine arises: individual enterprise, private profit, and the stark reality that if you don't own it, you don't belong here. This isn't just a shift in land tenure. It's a profound re-engineering of society itself, pushing people towards new forms of labor and new ways of thinking about their place in the world. The shift from open fields to enclosed parcels wasn't merely a change in agricultural practice. It was a societal earthquake, reshaping the very foundations of community and individual identity. You watch as a distant figure, once a neighbor with shared grazing rights, now tends a small, enclosed patch of land, their back hunched, their movements constrained by the new invisible lines that crisscross the landscape. The sense of belonging, once tied to the open land, is now tethered to a deed, a document, a name on a ledger. And as the sun finally breaks through the haze, illuminating the newly carved-up landscape, you can't help but feel a pang of something lost, something irreplaceable. This isn't just a story about fences. It's a story about the redefinition of freedom itself. You stand on the deck of a tall ship, the salty spray whipping your face as distant shores, unfamiliar and vibrant, emerge from the mists. Or perhaps you're trudging through a dense jungle, machete in hand, behind a surveyor squinting at a compass, drawing invisible lines that will soon dictate futures. The enclosures, remember those fenced-off commons that transformed English landscapes? Well, that very same insatiable hunger for clear-cut, definable ownership, that very same blueprint for taking communal resources and making them personal, it didn't stop at Dover. Oh no, it packed its bags, polished its boots, and set sail, convinced it had the answers for everyone else's messy, undefined territories. Imagine the sheer audacity, the unshakable conviction that allowed a few men with a flag and a parchment to declare an entire continent terra nullius, empty land. Empty, that is, except for the millions of people who had been living on it, farming it, hunting on it, and developing intricate systems of stewardship for millennia. It's a bit like someone walking into your beautifully arranged home, declaring it empty, because you don't have a giant neon sign proclaiming property of your name here above the door, then proceeding to rearrange the furniture and charge you rent. You'd probably call the police. They called it discovery. The concept that land could be owned in the European sense, with rigid, surveyed boundaries, deeds, and the right to exclude all others, was utterly alien to many indigenous cultures. For them, land was often held communally, used for specific purposes at different times, inherited through kinship, or managed through complex reciprocal relationships. You might have had rights to hunt in this forest, fish in that river, gather berries from that grove, but the idea of drawing a hard line around a section of earth and saying, "This square meter is mine, and if your cow steps one hoof over it, you owe me a lifetime supply of artisanal cheese," was simply preposterous. Consider the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, a truly mainstream historical fact, where Spain and Portugal, with the Pope's blessing, literally drew a vertical line down the Atlantic Ocean, neatly dividing the entire undiscovered, to them world into two spheres of influence. Never mind the inconvenient truth that people already lived there, or that the land wasn't theirs to divide. It was a cartographer's fantasy, an early colonial doodle that set the stage for centuries of aggressive land grabs, all justified by the simple stroke of a pen on a map that bore little resemblance to reality. This wasn't just about drawing lines on maps, though. It was about implementing entire legal and administrative systems. You see, the European powers brought their own legal frameworks, their own understanding of inheritance, taxation, and property rights. They established land registries, demanded titles, and often, if you couldn't produce a piece of paper proving your ownership, a paper that didn't exist in your cultural context, well, then the land was simply declared available. And by available, they usually meant available for us to take. This process, you might grimly note, often involved a generous application of gunpowder and steel, because as it turns out, gently explaining common law property rights tends to be less effective when the other party just wants to protect their ancestral hunting grounds. If you were an indigenous person trying to explain, "But grandfather's spirit walks here," to a conquistador whose sole aim was to find gold, you probably won't survive this conversation. And let's be honest, the conquistador probably wouldn't have cared. He was busy drawing up plans for his new hacienda, probably wondering if the local wildlife would taste good with a bit of paprika. A quirky tidbit that illustrates this clash comes from colonial North America, where various European powers would often purchase vast tracts of land from Native American tribes for shockingly paltry sums. A few blankets, some trinkets, maybe a barrel of rum. The European interpretation was a permanent transfer of ownership, a deed signed, sealed, and delivered. For many tribes, however, the transaction was understood as an agreement for shared use, or temporary access, or perhaps even a ceremonial exchange of goodwill, not an irreversible alienation of their ancestral lands. Imagine selling your garden gnome collection for a lifetime supply of premium coffee, only to find out you've actually sold your entire house. You'd be more than a little annoyed, wouldn't you? Historians still argue whether these purchases were genuine misunderstandings, deliberate deceptions, or a complex mix of both, exacerbated by power imbalances and vastly different worldviews. Was it truly a case of we thought we bought it, you thought you leased it for a weekend? Or was it a calculated exploitation of a fundamental cultural difference? The answer, like most things in history, is probably yes, all of the above, depending on the Tuesday. The imposition of fences, literally and figuratively, wasn't just about land ownership. It was about imposing a worldview. Colonial administrators often saw nomadic lifestyles as uncivilized and actively sought to compel indigenous populations to settle, to farm in fixed plots, and to adopt European agricultural practices. They believed that owning individual parcels of land would instill a sense of industry and responsibility. Never mind that many existing systems were perfectly sustainable and well adapted to their environments. You were essentially being told, your perfectly good, self-sustaining garden isn't a garden because you haven't built a brick wall around it and planted only monocrops. It was a peculiar form of agricultural snobbery, if you think about it. You couldn't exactly tax someone if they kept moving, now could you? Fixed property made fixed taxation possible, which coincidentally was very good for the colonial coffers. The very concept of improving land, central to European property law, also played a crucial role. If land wasn't being developed, which often meant being farmed in a European style or mined or deforested for timber, it was deemed unproductive and therefore ripe for redistribution. This mindset completely ignored sustainable indigenous practices, which might involve rotational hunting, selective gathering, or leaving land fallow to recover. And when people resisted this imposition, when they stood firm on their ancestral claims, the response was often swift and brutal. The fences of law were backed by the fences of bayonets, ensuring compliance through overwhelming force. Because nothing says private property quite like a well-armed militia. It really drives the point home, you know? And it wasn't just land. Colonial powers also asserted ownership over natural resources, minerals, timber, water, often overriding traditional harvesting rights or spiritual connections to these elements. Mountains, rivers, sacred groves, suddenly, these weren't shared ancestral spaces or living entities, but resources to be extracted, measured, and assigned a monetary value. The very soil beneath your feet, which your ancestors had walked upon for generations, could now be bought and sold by someone thousands of miles away, someone who had never even seen it. The lines drawn on maps in distant European capitals, often without any real knowledge of the local geography or the people living there, became devastatingly real. Imagine a group of bureaucrats in, say, London, drawing a straight line through a desert that happens to bisect several nomadic tribal territories, separating watering holes from grazing lands, ancestral burial sites from current settlements. The consequences of these abstract lines were famine, conflict, and displacement for those on the ground. These were not just lines on a map. They were lines of suffering, drawn with an imperial pen. The reverberations of this era continue to echo today. Land disputes, unresolved claims, and the legacy of forced displacement are still very much a part of the global conversation. The fences erected, the deeds notarized, the borders arbitrarily drawn in colonial times. They created a new reality of property, one that reshaped the world in ways that are still being unraveled. The sense of belonging, the right to land, forever altered by the stroke of a pen and the unwavering belief that their way was the only way. You can almost hear the rustle of surveyors' maps, the scratch of quill pens, and the distant, fading echoes of protests that went unheard. The world, once a vast, open tapestry of shared and transient territories, was being cut into increasingly smaller, privately owned squares, all under the watchful, possessive eye of empires. You're adrift now, not on a great ship, but on a sea of abstract lines, a place where the physical world bends to the whim of ink on parchment. You feel the faint shudder of a quill scratching across paper, an almost imperceptible vibration that will echo for centuries. Just moments ago, you witnessed the insatiable hunger of European powers, their ships fanning out across oceans, planting flags, and asserting dominion over lands they barely understood. Now, the grand, almost theatrical act of claiming the unknown truly begins, not with a roar of cannons or the clash of swords, but with the quiet, deliberate stroke of a cartographer's pen. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit chamber, the air thick with the smell of old paper and ambition. Before you lies a map, not one of intricate details showing every hill and river, but a sprawling, tantalizingly blank canvas, its edges hinting at vast, unexplored continents. To your left, a seasoned explorer, fresh from months at sea, recounts tales of coastlines and distant smokes, of fleeting glimpses of indigenous peoples. To your right, a royal emissary, quill poised, listens with an almost predatory focus. The explorer points vaguely to a distant horizon, describing a promontory, a great river, or a verdant plain. And with each whispered descriptor, the emissary, without ever having set foot on that soil, without knowing a single plant or creature that thrives there, draws a line. This is where the ethereal concept of colonial claim solidifies, where the vague notion of ours becomes a stark, undeniable boundary. You see the compasses swing. The rulers lay flat, creating perfect, geometric shapes that slice through jungles, desert, and mountain ranges, with an almost comedic disregard for natural topography or the countless communities already living there. It's an act of unparalleled audacity, a declaration that land, simply by being seen or rumored to be seen by one's own, ceases to be communal and becomes property. Take, for instance, the infamous scramble for Africa. You're not there in the sweltering heat of the continent, feeling the red dust under your boots. No, you're in Berlin, in a chandeliered room, feeling the chilling draft of a decision made thousands of miles away. It's 1884, and European powers, in a rather civilized fashion, if you consider carving up a continent civilized, are divvying up Africa like a particularly large cake. The lines they drew on maps became the future borders of nations, often bisecting tribes, merging historical enemies, or separating communities that had coexisted for millennia. You watch as a British delegate draws a ruler straight line from one point to another. Then a French one counters with an equally straight line. And suddenly, the vastness of the Congo Basin, for example, is neatly sectioned off. This wasn't just a mainstream historical fact. It was a blueprint for centuries of conflict and cultural displacement. And frankly, you probably wouldn't survive the geopolitical fallout if you were actually there trying to negotiate land rights with a ruler and a compass, much less the actual locals. The sheer absurdity of it is almost laughable, isn't it? Imagine two toddlers fighting over a toy they haven't even seen, but drawing elaborate diagrams of how they divide it. That's essentially what happened on a grand scale. The concept of terra nullius, empty land or land belonging to no one, was the legalistic magic trick that made it all possible. Even if indigenous populations were present, their complex systems of land use, their spiritual connections to the earth, their generational claims, were simply invisible to the European eye. To them, if it wasn't fenced, farmed with European methods, or marked with a government deed, it was unowned. It's like your neighbor claiming your garden because you don't have a fence around your prize-winning petunias, except on a continental scale with much higher stakes. And these lines, these arbitrary demarcations, weren't just about ownership. They were about control, resources, and power. The gold, the diamonds, the rubber, the spices, all flowed back to the drawing hands, enriching empires and fueling industrial revolutions. The people who lived on these lands found their ancient migratory paths suddenly bisected by invisible barriers, their hunting grounds now private property, their spiritual sites claimed by foreign powers. A quirky tidbit that emerges from this era of cartographic conquest is the sometimes hilarious inaccuracies of early maps. Explorers, eager to please their patrons, would sometimes sketch in phantom mountain ranges or non-existent rivers based on vague rumors or even outright fabrication. Imagine Queen Victoria commissioning a map, only to find out the majestic River of Plenty she'd been promised was actually just a rather enthusiastic seasonal puddle. These errors, once etched onto maps, often persisted, causing confusion and even conflict for decades, sometimes centuries, until accurate surveys could be performed. It's a bit like buying furniture based on someone's vague description, only to find it's a completely different shade of beige. Historians still argue whether the imposition of these rigid, linear borders was an inevitable consequence of global expansion or a unique pathology of European imperial ambition. Some argue that without these defined lines, even more chaotic land grabs would have ensued, while others contend that the very act of drawing them created artificial divisions that led to untold suffering and instability, the echoes of which are still heard today. You can almost hear the soft rustle of academic papers, the gentle murmur of debate, as scholars pick apart the motives and consequences of those decisive strokes of the quill. The arbitrary lines on maps, once mere speculative sketches, soon became actual lines on the ground, enforced by colonial administrators, border guards, and, ultimately, the weight of international law. The grand game of cartographic chess had begun, and the pieces were entire civilizations. You stand at the edge of an invisible line, a line that, unlike the ancient Roman roads or the feudal lord's ditch, you cannot see, cannot touch, and yet it is arguably the most powerful fence humanity has ever conceived. Remember those grand, sweeping gestures of colonial powers, drawing lines on maps with the casual flick of a quill, claiming vast territories they'd never truly seen. Well, now those lines begin to solidify. They morph from theoretical assertions into tangible, defended boundaries, the very sinews of modern nations. You feel the shift in the air, a thickening of the political atmosphere. Suddenly, land isn't just a resource for grazing or tilling, nor merely a domain for a king. It's becoming the very skin of a sovereign entity, a nation-state. This isn't just about owning a plot of dirt. It's about owning the sky above it, the ground beneath it, and every person, every resource, every whispered thought within its defined limits. The transition from vague spheres of influence to precisely demarcated national borders is a slow, grinding process, often stained with blood and marked by treaties. You're watching as the echoes of the 30 Years' War fade, leading to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, a mainstream historical fact that many scholars point to as the foundational moment for the modern nation-state system. This wasn't just about ending a devastating conflict. It was about establishing the principle of state sovereignty. Each ruler within their own territory held supreme authority, free from external interference. And to have that supreme authority, you first needed to know exactly where your territory began, and more importantly, where it ended. No more fuzzy edges, no more overlapping claims from emperors or popes. This was the moment the world started getting its act together, cartographically speaking, though it was still a long, messy road. Imagine standing on a remote mountain pass, feeling the bite of the wind. Before, it was just a mountain pass. Now it's the mountain pass, a strategic choke point where one nation's claim meets another's. You see surveyors, not the ancient Egyptian ones with their ropes reapportioning Nile-soaked fields, but men with sophisticated instruments, sighting through telescopes, hammering markers into the ground. They're meticulously tracing the lines that diplomats drew in distant, opulent halls. Rivers become the middle of the river, or one bank, or the other, depending on the treaty. Mountain ranges become crests, or valleys, or an imaginary line running through the highest peaks. These aren't temporary fences for your crops, nor are they the walls of a village. These are the lines that divide entire peoples, cultures, and destinies. And what happens if you stray across one of these increasingly defined lines without permission? Well, my friend, you probably won't survive this scenario without a stern talking to, a fine, or perhaps an entirely new, unwanted geopolitical incident. The stakes are considerably higher than simply trampling on your neighbor's ancestral plot. Remember those. The rise of nationalism, that fervent belief in the unique identity and destiny of a particular group of people, often tied to a specific territory, accelerates this process. You feel the collective pulse of a population defining itself against its neighbors, strengthening the demand for clear, defensible boundaries. Think about how those arbitrary lines drawn by colonialists, remember them. They started to chafe, to feel like ill-fitting garments on the emerging bodies of independent nations. The drawing of borders often meant the splitting of communities, the forced integration of disparate groups, or the creation of irredentist claims that would fuel conflicts for centuries to come. It's like trying to perfectly slice a marbled cake with a dull knife. Some chunks are going to be uneven, and someone's going to complain about getting less frosting. Consider the quirky tidbit of the three countries stone, or Valserberg, where the borders of Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands meet at a single point. It's a literal convergence of national claims, a physical manifestation of these political constructs. You can stand there, one foot in Germany, one in Belgium, and wave at someone in the Netherlands, all without actually moving very much. It's a stark contrast to the vast, undefined hunting grounds you roamed at the dawn of human history. From land shared by all, to land marked for crops, to village territories, to feudal domains, to vast colonial claims, and now to these precise, almost surgical lines defining sovereign nations. Historians still argue whether the Westphalian system truly created modern sovereignty or merely codified existing trends and practices, especially given the continuous evolution of international law and global interconnectedness. But what is undeniable is that the concept of a fixed, universally recognized national border, enforceable by the state that controls it, became a dominant paradigm. The era of a truly wandering, shared Earth is now definitively over. You live in a world sliced and diced by agreements, by history, and by power, each slice meticulously guarded, each boundary a declaration of identity and independence. From the grand, sweeping lines of newly drawn nation-state borders, your focus narrows, deep into the beating heart of economic transformation. You find yourself now amidst the clamor and the smoke, as industrial property expands, the industrial era introducing new forms of property like factories. These aren't just bigger farms, mind you, or even larger manors. Oh no. These are entirely different beasts, sprawling concrete and brick titans that swallow up acres, then spew out goods, and with them an entirely new understanding of ownership. Imagine a landscape, barely a century prior, where wealth was measured in fertile fields, grazing sheep, or perhaps a quaint cottage with a patch of garden. Now you stand before a monstrous edifice, perhaps in a place like Manchester, a towering structure of brick and glass, with hundreds, even thousands of windows, each one hinting at the whirring machinery within. This is not property for planting seeds or raising cattle. This is property designed for making things rapidly, repeatedly, and on a scale that would have made a medieval lord's eyes water. The air around you is thick with the smell of coal smoke and machine oil. The ground beneath your feet vibrating with the relentless rhythm of power looms or forging hammers. You can almost feel the heat radiating from the steam engines, the very engines that are the pulse of this new property. The factory itself, in all its grimy glory, becomes a singular, complex unit of ownership. It's not just the land it sits on, which, remember, was once probably common land or a small farmer's plot, now bought up and consolidated. It's also the building, purpose-built with multiple floors designed to house specific machinery, the massive boilers and intricate pipe systems, the power-transmitting belts whirring through the air like giant mechanical snakes. And then there are the machines themselves, the power looms, the spinning jennies, the vast printing presses, each a marvel of engineering, each representing a significant investment of capital, and each, unequivocally, someone's property. This is a far cry from the simple inheritance of a plot your ancestors tilled, isn't it? This is property that requires an army of financiers, engineers, and a whole new kind of legal mind to even begin to comprehend. This concentration of productive capacity demanded new ways of defining and protecting ownership. You see, when wealth was primarily land, its boundaries were visible, albeit sometimes disputed, like those ancient Nile floodplains needing resurveying. But a factory's value wasn't just in its footprint. It was in its potential output, its patented designs, its workforce. Speaking of which, the quirky tidbit for the day, early factory owners often housed their workers in purpose-built company towns, where every brick, every shop, even the pub, was part of the factory's expanded property, blurring the lines between living space and industrial asset. Imagine having your landlord also be your boss, the one who sets your wages and controls the very store where you buy your dinner. It's enough to make you long for a return to foraging, though you probably wouldn't survive a single winter. The mainstream historical fact woven into this tapestry of industrial expansion is, of course, the widespread adoption of steam power. The development of efficient steam engines by figures like James Watt didn't just power individual machines. It allowed for the centralization of production. Before, scattered cottage industries relied on water power or human muscle. Now, vast, multi-story mills could be built anywhere coal and a workforce were available, making the factory, rather than the isolated homestead, the definitive unit of production and thus a highly concentrated form of property. The very scale of these operations necessitated new legal structures. Think of the rise of limited liability companies, for instance. Suddenly, individuals could invest in these gargantuan enterprises without risking their entire personal fortune, a legal innovation as crucial to industrial expansion as any mechanical invention. This shift also meant that the nature of property expanded beyond the purely tangible. While the factory building was solid, the machinery within had intellectual property tied to it, patents protecting the ingenious designs that gave one mill an edge over another. This marked the very early inklings of what we now call intellectual property rights. Rights that would eventually become as valuable, if not more so, than the physical factories themselves. How do you draw a border around an idea, though? How do you define a fence around a blueprint? These questions, born in the din of the Industrial Revolution, still echo in our digital age. Historians still argue whether the legal evolution of property rights primarily drove technological innovation, or if it merely adapted to the irresistible force of new inventions. You can almost feel the migration, a constant churn of humanity moving from the quiet fields you once knew, flocking to the burgeoning industrial centers, all drawn by the promise, however harsh, of work within these new property behemoths. The factory, therefore, wasn't just a building. It was a magnet, drawing in labor, creating new urban landscapes, and forging entirely new social classes. The property of the industrialist, the owner of the means of production, stood in stark contrast to the property of the worker, often just their labor, their minimal possessions, and perhaps a rented room in one of those newly built, tightly packed tenement blocks. It was a world rapidly changing, solidifying new types of ownership, and in doing so, constructing invisible, yet incredibly powerful, new fences around wealth and opportunity. The borders weren't just lines on a map anymore. They were the very walls of the factory, separating the owner from the owned, the product from the process, and in many ways, one life from another. You remember those sprawling factory complexes, those vast swathes of land where chimneys spewed smoke and machinery hummed, their borders often defined by a chain-link fence, or perhaps just the limits of a powerful owner's ambition. Back then, property lines were getting more defined, sure, but they still felt earthly, tangible. You could walk them, touch the markers, argue with your neighbor over a slightly crooked fence post. Ah, the good old days of physical altercations over a few inches of disputed soil. Simpler times, really. But now, as you float gently through the digital ether of our shared historical journey, the very ground beneath your proverbial feet has undergone a seismic shift, not in its physical form, but in how we perceive and, more importantly, define it. We're talking about precision so mind-bogglingly accurate. It makes those Roman surveyors squinting at their Groma look like kids playing in a sandbox with a stick. You're entering the era of GPS, or the global positioning system, and with it, land itself becomes less about muddy boots and more about invisible waves and numerical coordinates. Imagine, if you will, thousands of miles above your sleepy head, a constellation of satellites, silently orbiting, constantly broadcasting signals down to Earth. These aren't just for helping you find the nearest coffee shop. Mind you, though they do an admirable job of that. For the land surveyor, these signals are like digital breadcrumbs, leading them to an exact spot on the planet, accurate down to a few centimeters. No more relying on worn-out maps, ancient stone markers that have shifted over centuries, or the slightly tipsy testimony of old farmer McGregor about where his grandpappy swore the oak tree used to be. Now it's all about the cold, hard, undisputed mathematics of longitude, latitude, and elevation. The mainstream historical fact here is fascinating. The GPS system, originally developed by the United States military for incredibly precise navigation and targeting, was intentionally degraded for civilian use, a policy known as selective availability. This meant that while the military could pinpoint locations with extreme accuracy, your everyday GPS device, if you had one back then, would be off by dozens of meters. Can you imagine trying to survey a property line with that kind of fuzziness? It would be like trying to draw a straight line after 3 espressos, and a particularly long night of pondering the mysteries of the universe. But then, in the year 2000, that degradation was switched off, unleashing true, unadulterated precision upon the world, and property lines, quite literally, snapped into hyperfocus. Suddenly, those factory borders, those vast expanses of privately owned land, could be defined with an exactitude that would make Hammurabi weep with joy, or perhaps frustration, given the newfound complexity for his ancient scribes. This leap in precision didn't just make surveying easier, it fundamentally altered the concept of a boundary. A property line is no longer just an imaginary line between 2 fence posts. It's a series of georeferenced points, recorded in digital databases, accessible to anyone with the right equipment and permissions. This is where the quirky tidbit comes in. In some places, particularly where land records are ancient and poorly maintained, the sheer precision of GPS has actually created new disputes. You see, when a historical deed describes a boundary as to the old oak tree by the creek, and then a GPS survey reveals that the old oak tree is actually 20 feet away from where everyone thought the boundary was, well, things can get hilariously, or tragically, complicated. Old assumptions crumble under the unforgiving glare of satellite data. It's like discovering your family heirloom wasn't where Uncle Barry said it was, but 20 feet into your neighbor's yard, who now has the GPS data to prove it. Awkward, this modern surveying isn't just about drawing lines on a digital map. It's about making those lines legally, irrevocably real. When you buy a piece of land today, the deed doesn't just describe it. It often refers to a survey plan that includes precise GPS coordinates for every corner and curve. This creates a kind of immutable, almost sacred definition of ownership. You can't just move your fence further into your neighbor's yard anymore without a surveyor showing up with a tablet and a stern look, confirming that your new fence post is, in fact, violating their digital territory. And let me tell you, trying to argue with a satellite about property lines is a battle you probably won't survive without legal representation and a very thick skin. The digital map has become the ultimate arbiter, replacing old arguments with irrefutable data. This precision has profound implications for how we understand national borders, too. Remember those arbitrary lines explorers drew on maps, claiming vast, unowned territories with a flourish of a quill. Now, those lines are often defined by a series of precise GPS waypoints, meticulously agreed upon in international treaties. While the history of how they came to be might still be riddled with colonialism and conflict, their current definition is increasingly a matter of cold, hard coordinates. This has led to some fascinating and often tense situations, especially in areas with fluid natural boundaries, like rivers that shift course. Historians still argue whether the hyper-precision of modern mapping truly resolves ancient land disputes, or merely redefines them with a new layer of complexity, particularly in regions where traditional, communal land ownership models clash with Western concepts of individually parceled, digitally defined property. Some argue that this scientific certainty actually strips away the organic, lived experience of the land, replacing it with an abstract grid. Others maintain it's a necessary step for global stability and efficient resource management. It's a bit like debating whether a perfectly calibrated compass makes you a better explorer or just a more precise robot. As you drift into the quiet hum of these unseen signals, consider how far we've come. From wandering nomads who saw land as a shared pathway, to tiny plots nudged by seeds, to fortified villages, then vast feudal domains, and finally to the industrial sprawl. Each step brought new ways of defining mine and yours. Now, with GPS, those definitions are woven into the very fabric of the digital world, invisible yet undeniably potent. Your backyard isn't just dirt and grass. It's a set of numbers meticulously recorded, protected by satellites high above. It's a pretty neat trick, turning dirt into data, wouldn't you agree? It makes you wonder what invisible lines we'll invent next. Digital landscapes. Explore the abstract world of virtual property, NFTs, and data ownership. You glide now through an invisible ether, a realm where the very concept of land stretches beyond the horizon of your senses. No longer do you feel the rough bark of a fence post against your palm, or the grit of soil beneath your boots as GPS pins down your every step. Now you float. You exist in a landscape of pure information, a world where boundaries aren't drawn with wire and wood, but with lines of code, cryptographic keys, and the shifting sands of consensus protocols. You could try to build a fence around a cloud, of course, but you'd look rather silly. And frankly, you probably won't survive this particular conceptual leap without a mild headache. Remember all that talk about Hammurabi's laws, the Roman legions parceling out conquered territory, or feudal lords carving up medieval Europe with a quill and a self-important flourish. Well, take all those meticulously plotted maps, all those deeds written on parchment and sealed with wax, and vaporize them. Because here, in the shimmering expanse of the digital landscape, property has undergone its most profound metamorphosis yet. Your journey into this abstract ownership begins subtly, perhaps with something as mundane as a username. Remember the scramble for early email addresses or social media handles. That unique string of characters became your first digital plot. You didn't own it in the traditional sense, but you controlled it, you identified with it, and woe betide anyone who tried to squat on your desired handle. Then came domain names, the digital addresses of the internet. Suddenly, a string of letters like yourcompany.com became incredibly valuable real estate, even though it existed purely as an entry in a distributed database. The very first commercial domain name, symbolics.com, registered in 1985, marked a silent, yet seismic shift in what could be considered ownable property. It wasn't land, it wasn't a factory, it was an address in a placeless, borderless new frontier. Try explaining that to a Roman surveyor. Yes, I own this series of dots and letters. It's very important. No, you can't see it. But the real Wild West of digital property truly erupted with the advent of virtual worlds. Think back to the early 2000s to places like Second Life, where players could purchase virtual plots of land. You could build structures, host events, even run businesses within these digital realms. People were spending real money, sometimes significant sums, to acquire these fantastical, non-physical parcels. And if you bought the land next to a giant, pixelated cat that kept singing off-key, well, that was your problem. It was a bizarre echo of the enclosure movement, only instead of sheep, we were fencing in polygons and rendering algorithms. This early foray proved that humans, even in virtual spaces, still craved the concept of exclusive territory, a corner of the digital universe to call their own. Then, with the quiet hum of a server farm, came the blockchain. This distributed, immutable ledger system, originally designed to underpin cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, suddenly offered a revolutionary new way to prove ownership of anything digital. And that, my friend, is where non-fungible tokens, or NFTs, sashayed onto the scene, bringing with them a tidal wave of confusion, hype, and genuine innovation. An NFT isn't the digital artwork itself, mind you. It's more like a certificate of authenticity, a unique digital signature on the blockchain that points to a specific digital asset, be it a JPEG of a particularly bored-looking ape, a snippet of music, or even, yes, a parcel of virtual land in a metaverse like Decentraland or the Sandbox. This is where your brain might start to do a little jig. How can something infinitely copyable, something that exists as data on countless servers, be truly owned in the way a medieval lord owned his manor? Yet the blockchain, through its inherent transparency and cryptographic security, creates a verifiable scarcity in a world of infinite duplication. When you buy an NFT, you're not buying the image you can right-click and save. You're buying the unique, irrefutable entry on a public ledger that says, this person owns this specific token associated with that image. It's like owning the original Mona Lisa. Everyone can see a reproduction, but only one person owns the physical painting. Or, in this case, the unique digital string of characters that represents it. Historians still argue whether this new paradigm truly constitutes ownership, or merely a highly sophisticated form of digital bragging rights. Some argue it's just a new kind of collectible, others insist it's the foundation of a decentralized digital future. And then there's data ownership, a landscape far more pervasive and often more invisible. Who owns the data you generate just by living your life online? Your browsing history, your location data, your purchase habits, your interactions. Are these digital properties that you own, or are they harvested and owned by the platforms and corporations that collect them? The lines here are incredibly blurry, constantly being redrawn by new regulations like GDPR, yet still largely unfenced. You might not have a deed to your digital footprint, but it is undeniably valuable. More valuable, perhaps, than that little patch of virtual earth you bought to grow pixelated carrots. The borders of data ownership are perhaps the most fluid and contentious of all the digital landscapes. Unlike a physical fence you can see and touch, these boundaries are defined by terms of service agreements written in microscopic font and the ever-evolving policies of tech giants. So, as you drift in this digital expanse, consider how far you've come from the earliest, temporary marks scratched into the earth by nomadic farmers. From mud walls to Roman charters, from manorial rights to precise GPS coordinates. The concept of property has always reflected the prevailing technologies and social structures of the age. Now you exist in a world where land is not just dirt, but data, where boundaries are not just fences, but lines of code. It's a quiet revolution, often unfolding while you scroll through social media, a new kind of property being forged in the unseen fires of the internet. You click your mouse, zoom out on the digital map, and the neatly drawn borders that just minutes ago seemed so solid, so unassailable, begin to waver. Because even with GPS pinpointing and blockchain ledgering, the lines you just explored in the digital realm can't quite erase the older, deeper claims etched into the very earth beneath your feet. We've talked about how property became real, how fences became real, how those invisible lines hardened into legal certainties. But what happens when those certainties clash with an even more ancient reality? What happens when the land itself remembers a different story, a different owner, a different way of belonging? You might stand on a bustling city street right now, the pavement firm beneath your shoes, surrounded by buildings that scream permanence and ownership. Yet look closely, and you might see the ghostly outlines of ancient footpaths, the whisper of languages long suppressed, the shadow of agreements shattered by the relentless march of perceived progress. This is the enduring legacy of disputed ground, the very real, often painful friction where two vastly different concepts of land, belonging, and identity collide. Consider, for a moment, the immense, sprawling lands of what is now called North America. For millennia, indigenous peoples lived in intricate, sustainable relationships with this earth, their boundaries fluid, often defined by natural features, seasonal movements, and shared responsibilities rather than rigid lines. Land was not something to be owned in the European sense, but rather a relative, a provider, a sacred trust to be stewarded for future generations. Then, the colonial claims spread, as we discussed, like ink stains across a pristine map, declaring vast territories terra nullius, nobody's land, despite the vibrant societies already thriving there. It was, frankly, a bit like someone declaring your living room unoccupied, because you don't have a deed registered with their obscure administrative body. Bit rude, wouldn't you say? The fallout from this clash of concepts echoes to this very day. You see it in the ongoing legal battles over ancestral territories, the protests against resource extraction on sacred sites, the tireless advocacy for the return of lands unjustly taken. One mainstream historical fact you might consider is the sheer volume of broken treaties. Across the United States alone, hundreds of treaties were signed between indigenous nations and the U.S. government, formalizing boundaries and promises. And remarkably, almost all of them were subsequently violated, reinterpreted, or simply ignored when it suited the expansionist agenda. It's like shaking hands on a deal, then immediately crossing your fingers behind your back and saying, "Oops, guess that doesn't count." This isn't just about dusty old parchments, mind you. The concept of indigenous rights, particularly in relation to land, has gained significant international recognition, albeit often slowly and reluctantly. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, for instance, affirms their right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. It's a powerful statement, but translating that on paper into tangible change on the ground, where mining companies and national interests often hold sway, is a whole other beast. You might find it a quirky tidbit that some indigenous legal systems don't just consider human rights, but also the rights of nature, or rights of the river, where natural entities themselves are recognized as legal persons with inherent rights. A concept far removed from the Western idea of nature as merely a resource to be exploited. Imagine a lawsuit filed on behalf of a grumpy mountain. Your Honor, the plaintiff, Mount Cindercone, moves for an injunction against the defendant's egregious clear-cutting, citing emotional distress and a significant loss of prime squirrel habitat. The courtroom would probably need extra sturdy benches for that one. The reality, of course, is far less whimsical. These are disputes steeped in dispossession, cultural destruction, and often violence. You stand, metaphorically, at the intersection of history and the present, witnessing the enduring struggle for justice and recognition. Think of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe's battle against the Dakota Access Pipeline. A powerful modern example of indigenous peoples asserting their sovereignty and traditional land rights against a multi-billion-dollar project. The images of water protectors, often facing harsh conditions and militarized police, underscore the high stakes involved. This wasn't just about a pipe in the ground. It was about protecting ancestral lands, sacred waters, and a way of life intrinsically tied to the earth. And while it all sounds academic and distant, remember this. If you ever found yourself living on a plot of land suddenly declared disputed territory by two powerful, warring nations, well, let's just say your odds of surviving that particular geopolitical real estate negotiation would be less than ideal. You'd quickly realize that the abstract concept of lines on a map can have brutally concrete consequences on your doorstep. Historians still argue whether the terra nullius doctrine, which underpinned much of colonial expansion, was a deliberate act of erasure and legal fiction, or a tragic misunderstanding by Europeans of complex, non-Western land tenure systems. Was it pure malice or simply profound ethnocentric ignorance? Perhaps a bit of both, a convenient blindness that justified vast appropriation. Whatever the intent, the impact was devastating and continues to shape the present. The concept of reconciliation is often invoked in these discussions. But what does it truly mean when the very ground beneath your feet is the subject of an ongoing argument? Is it merely symbolic gestures? Or does it demand genuine land back, true self-determination, and a fundamental shift in how societies view and interact with the earth? You feel the tension in the air, the weight of centuries of unresolved claims. The lines that define property, borders, and nations, as solid as they appear on modern maps, are in many places still shimmering with the unresolved echoes of a past that refuses to be forgotten. These aren't just lines. They are living scars, reminders that what is real to one group can be a profound injustice to another. You're floating now, not quite awake, not quite asleep, but somewhere in that liminal space where the future whispers. You see Earth from a distance, a swirling blue and white marble, not unlike the one you might have tried to claim as yours on a playground back when boundaries were just chalk lines and fierce declarations. But look closer. Are those property lines etched into the atmosphere, defining breathable air quotas? Is that a giant, shimmering dome over a desert, clearly marked with a corporate logo, asserting ownership over newly desalinated water reserves? It's a funny thought, isn't it? The very air you breathe, the water that sustains you, once considered utterly common, now potentially parceled up, bought, and sold. Oh, don't worry too much, though. You probably won't survive long enough to have to mortgage your atmospheric breathing rights. Just a little reality check for our journey into tomorrow. As you drift, the landscapes below morph, not just geographically, but conceptually. The solid, familiar lines of fences and borders, the neatly drawn rectangles of deeds and titles, they start to shimmer, to blur. The future, you see, isn't just about drawing more lines. It's about what happens when the lines we've drawn become utterly untenable. Think climate change, for instance. Rising sea levels don't politely stop at national borders. They redraw coastlines with a ruthless disregard for human legalities. Entire island nations could become submerged, their land, once so meticulously mapped and owned, dissolving into a watery commons. What then? Do property rights float along with the displaced populations, or do they simply cease to exist, forcing a global reconsideration of what ownership means when the very ground beneath your feet is gone? Or consider resource scarcity. We've seen disputes over oil, over diamonds, over ancient fertile lands. But what if the next great scramble isn't for a specific plot of earth, but for the fundamental building blocks of life itself? Clean water, arable soil that hasn't been rendered barren, even access to unpolluted sunlight. When these become critically scarce, will the concept of individual ownership truly hold up? Or will necessity drive us back towards a more collective, communal approach, reminiscent of those early nomadic tribes who simply shared what the land offered? You can almost hear the negotiations now. "Excuse me, could I borrow some of your oxygen? Mine seems to have run out after my neighbor's industrial-grade avocado farm expanded." It sounds absurd, but the pressures on our planet are real, and they might just force us to think less about my land and more about our planet. Indeed, historians still argue whether the enclosure movements of centuries past were a necessary evil for economic progress or a catastrophic loss of communal life. And this debate echoes loudly as we consider the future of shared resources. Just as common lands were privatized for sheep grazing and industrial expansion, we might see a reversal, a recommoning of essential resources driven by global need. Consider the burgeoning field of space exploration. When humanity inevitably expands beyond Earth, what about property rights on the Moon, or Mars, or even asteroids? The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, a mainstream historical fact you might recall, explicitly states that outer space is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty. It's the ultimate common heritage. But private companies are already looking at mining asteroids for precious minerals. Will we see celestial fences, or even, more bizarrely, digital deeds to plots of lunar dust? Imagine trying to evict someone from their moon crater. "Sir, I'm afraid your orbital trajectory suggests you've trespassed on sector Beta 7. That'll be 3 barrels of refined helium-3, please." It's enough to make you wonder if humanity ever truly learns, or if we just scale our squabbles up to cosmic proportions. Then there's the quirky tidbit of digital property. We've already explored virtual land and NFTs, but what happens when the boundaries between physical and digital completely dissolve? Imagine owning the data stream of your personal biological output, your unique genetic code, or even your consciousness uploaded into a digital realm. Are those data points yours in the same way your house is? Could someone else mine your biodata for profit, or build a digital fence around your virtual identity? It pushes the very limits of what we define as property, reminding us that the concept is far more fluid than we often assume. If you think the neighborhood association is strict now, wait until they start fining you for unapproved pixelated garden gnomes in your metaverse plot. As the outlines of future challenges become clearer, so too does the potential for new solutions. Perhaps we'll see a rise in global governance models for shared resources, where international bodies manage everything from atmospheric carbon budgets to deep-sea mineral rights. Imagine a future where the concept of a sovereign border is less about exclusionary control and more about shared stewardship. Maybe the true evolution of property isn't about stronger fences, but about more intelligent, collaborative agreements on how we, as a species, manage our finite planetary and extraplanetary resources. It's a vast, hopeful vision, but also one fraught with the same human tendencies for greed and conflict that have shaped our history of ownership. The challenges ahead are immense, urging us to consider whether fences truly protect us or merely constrain our collective ability to adapt. Now, as the distant visions of tomorrow begin to soften and blur, allow yourself to drift back, gently, to the familiar comfort of your own space. The vastness of the future, with its complex questions of shared Earth and evolving boundaries, begins to recede, becoming a quiet hum in the background. Feel the familiar weight of your blanket, the softness of your pillow, anchoring you firmly in the present moment, in the gentle stillness of this very room. The grand concepts of property and possession, which have shaped human history and perhaps even your own day, are now settling, dissolving into the quietude of the night. The subtle scent of your linens, the cool air against your skin, these are the simple realities that ground you. All the intricate arguments over land and ownership, the ancient codes and modern mapping, are fading like old whispers, leaving only a sense of calm. There's no need to define borders in the quiet dark, no need to draw lines in the peaceful stillness. Just the rhythmic rise and fall of your breath, a gentle wave washing over everything. Let your thoughts soften, allowing any remaining worries about yesterday's enclosures or tomorrow's shared Earth to simply dissipate into the peaceful, boundless night. You are safe here, nestled and secure, surrounded by nothing but tranquility. Allow yourself to sink deeper into the quiet, warm embrace of sleep, where all lines blur and peace reigns supreme. Sweet dreams.